Hi, waiting for your 3D scenes to finish rendering, it sucks. But weirdly, this is something that goes over a lot of our heads. I was a prime example of this. Back when I was starting out with Blender, I put together this absolute masterpiece. For those that don't know, this is from the Anvil tutorial by Blender Guru. This took me 4 minutes to render, and that's 4 minutes each frame. I thought this was normal. I stuck with these default render settings for way too long. But fast forward to July of last year, me and my girlfriend decided that we were going to take some time off work and see some of Bali and Australia. At this point of my 3D journey, if you want to call it that, I was focused on consistency and growing my social media platforms. But if I wanted to keep posting while I was away, I would need to bring my laptop. And this is where I ran into a huge problem. The laptop I was bringing with me was a M1 MacBook Pro. This laptop is amazing, but if any of you have tried using Blender on a Mac, you know the struggle. In fact, many of the render tests that I did before I'd even left ended in a no memory error. So I wasn't even able to render a single frame. I had to find a way around this. And that's when I learned to drastically speed up my render times. First of all, it is important to note that we all have different PCs and laptops. This, unfortunately, will be the main difference between a fast render and a slow one. Don't let this put you off though. After following the steps I now take with pretty much every project, I can almost guarantee you will see massive improvements. So let's get started. Render device. I personally use Cycles, so the first thing I do when starting a new project is I make sure I have this selected, as well as GPU for the render device. Obviously, this can only be selected if you have a GPU. If you don't, there are still plenty of other steps, but if you do, you definitely want this selected. Following this, you can go into the preference settings and select the specific GPU and CPU that you have. This will further optimize Blender to your specifications. Samples. I always lower my max samples on Blender to between 25 and 128. This is especially useful for when you're doing quick test renders to see how you're coming along. Trust me, I've saved so much time just by doing this. You can always bump up the number of samples for the big final render, but in most cases, you won't really notice any difference. You may also see people mentioning noise threshold. Making changes to this pretty much will speed up your render times, but in my experience this has only ever resulted in a poorer end render. So I usually sacrifice the render time in this example just to end with a nicer looking render, but obviously that's up to you. Light paths. Okay, now this is a big one, make sure you're sat down. Light paths control how Blender simulate the interaction of light in your scene. This includes diffuse, glossy, transmission, volume and transparency. Essentially, the higher these values, the more accurate your lighting in your scene will be. But this obviously comes at a cost, and that cost is time. In most cases, you don't need your light paths to be set at the level that they are as default. These are quite high. When I first found out about this tip, I wasn't too sure what each section did, so I basically just changed them all to 4 or 5. Personally, I think that's fine. It ensures that everything is ticked. The main thing I would keep an eye on is the transparency. If you have glass or water in your scene, basically any object that light will be passing through, these are the examples where you want to be focusing on specifically that part of the light pass. Make adjustments to these numbers and check out the results in the render view of the viewport. I would say as a general rule, if you don't have any transparent objects in your scene, you can keep the transparency number super low or even 0. A quick tip though off the back of this, if you are at the end of your render seeing weird lighting artifacts or the objects are looking a bit glitchy, then it's a good idea to refer back to the light paths and make sure you haven't made too many changes. If a specific number is made too low, then the light won't be able to reach these parts of your object and, they just won't look right. So make sure you're not changing this too much. Tiling. This is on by default, but adjusting the tiling size can take some weight off your hardware shoulders. I usually leave this where it is, but if I'm struggling to complete a render, I'll sometimes lower the tiling size to make the scene more manageable. Persistent data. Super quick step. Tick this box and you're done. This does use some extra memory, so bear that in mind. It essentially stores render data, so less work is needed when you're continuously re-rendering scenes or animations. Rendered view. Again, this is a simple one. If you're in rendered view, come out of it. Essentially, when you hit render, you want to make sure Blender's doing as little work in the background as possible. So if you're rendering and you are also in the render view, come out of that and it should speed up your renders. Some extra things to note. For the longest time, I was rendering as an FFmpeg video. Basically, the Blender video editor scared me and I didn't see the benefits in rendering as single frames. This is fine until your PC crashes or you run out of time. Both of these have happened to me and it can really hurt. I now render my animations as PNG frames in a single folder. I can then hop into the Blender video editor and put all the frames together, and then I render this out as a video, and it's a lot more simple. This is perfect if you are in a rush. You can render out half your scene, come back, render the rest, and it's simple. And then I also wanted to mention denoising. You may want to deselect the these nuts. You may also want to deselect this denoise box. You can then add a denoise modifier in the composite section of Blender. I didn't want to make this its own main section because personally I don't really notice much of a difference in render times with this, but I do still do this with most projects. I don't know, I think it just gives me more flexibility with how much is being denoised. But you can definitely give this a try yourself and see if it makes a difference with your render times. While going over these points, I've been rendering my beautiful anvil in the background. By applying these steps, I've taken my render time from 92 minutes. I can't believe this scene took 92 minutes to render originally, to a much more manageable 7 minutes. These are the settings that I used. You can see I bumped up the sample slightly. The highlights weren't really showing, so this fixed that, and it still significantly brought down the render time. Obviously, this is a super basic scene. In fact, it probably doesn't get much more basic. And if you are going for the most highest quality render possible, you may not be able to take all of these steps. For example, client work, or if you just want a super enlarged image, you may need to go into more detail, which means bumping up some of these settings. But I can guarantee if you take this on board, it will, at the very least, I've been struggling to say that, speed up the creation process. These helped me on my travels around Bali with only my laptop, and they still help me today on my main setup. Let me know how this video has helped you with your projects. If you do have any other tips on cutting down your render times, please put it in the comments. This can help others who come into the video, and also me. You know, I'm always trying to learn and be better, so that helps. Please also consider subscribing and following me on my Instagram and my TikTok pages. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you are still here, comment cheese, blue cheese. Tell me your favorite cheese. How about that? Tell me your favorite cheese. I think that's about everything. I appreciate your time, and I am Josh. I do 3D, hence the name Josh Doing 3D. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Adios.